quantum mechanics and how...
Okay. Yeah. So what I did is I compiled this like little table from different books I read or things I learned, seminars, etc. And on the table, what I did is I wrote down all these like things that quantum mechanics or modern science says. And then what's interesting is I collected the ones that have like analogous, interesting thing to say about God. So I can give you a couple examples. I don't know if I gave any in class, but one example is, I don't know if I talked about like light, but the speed of light is is as fast as something can go in the universe, sort of. And so what happens is light, since it's going so fast, the faster you go, what the theory of relativity says, the slower, from an outside observer, the slower your clock is ticking. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, it doesn't make sense really, but that's what it says.
Okay.
So that from an outside observer, like let's say we were twins, and you went on the space shuttle and went at speeds really fast around the Earth and came back. When you came back, hundreds or thousands of years could have passed. Because from my observation point, your clock was ticking really slowly. Because higher velocities, according to the theory of relativity, means that your clock ticks slower.
Okay.
Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
It's kind of weird, I understand.
It's hard to grasp, but
It's totally ungraspable.
Yeah.
But what that essentially means is that as you approach the speed of light, your clock ticks slower and slower. It's such that at light speed, light is outside of time. So what that means is, if you could like ride a light beam and see things and that sort of stuff, you would see past, present, and future all at the same time. Why that's interesting, that's science. Why that's interesting is there's an interesting God analogy, in that God describes himself as light in the Bible. Right? Like, God is light. And why that's interesting is God also describes himself as seeing past, present, future at all time. He's outside of time. So there's an interesting analogy where theologically people before would have said, well, that doesn't make sense that God's outside of time. But we have physical examples in our universe where there are entities outside of time.
So it's a plausible thing.
It's a plausible idea.
Yeah.
It at least makes some sense.
Yeah.
Another example is that before modern science, scientists thought the universe was eternal, meaning having no beginning, no end. Then came out with like the Big Bang Theory, which I think you're familiar with, which basically says at some point time and space and matter began. Before that, there was no time or space or matter. And so there's this initiation point. That was really a cool thing to find out for Christians, for example, because there used to be this big rift where people who believed in the Bible thought there's a beginning. Where scientists didn't think so. So it was like, how do you explain that? Well, now modern science helps explain that. And there's an analogous thing for the end. Science now thinks there's going to be an end to our universe.
And that's...
at some point. And which also, like, according to the Bible, there's going to be an end to the universe.
And that's when God comes down and, like... Or...
ultimately, new heavens, new earth, the old order is be destroyed.
Is that what's talked about in Revelations?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
And other places.
But namely, Revelation, is that right? That's like the main focus.
Revelation and Isaiah is another place where it talks about it.
Okay.
But yeah, Revelation's all about, a lot about the end times. Yeah,
I haven't read it before, but yeah, that's
it's pretty crazy.
Yeah. It's kind of scary too, I've heard.
Yeah. Definitely.
That's interesting.
Does that help make sense? So those are just a couple examples of maybe 20 that I've collected.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's more out there, but where it can kind of make sense. Okay, there's, there can be a God. Or at least the idea of God is not so foreign with respect to science. Let me see if I can think of another example. It doesn't work as smoothly, but Jesus is known as both human and God at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? He's both divine and human.
Yeah.
Not fully divine, fully human, I guess I should say. That has an interesting analogy in science, or counter idea, which is light is both a particle and a wave at the same time. Sometimes it manifests more as a wave, sometimes it manifests more as a particle.
Okay.
So that's interesting. That is a thing in science, which is two things at the same time, manifesting in one or another way, different situations. So there's a lot of examples like that.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because like the scientific examples you're telling me, like I've known, like I've heard them all before, but I never drew the connection between those and like God and stuff.
Yeah, and go ahead.
And then because I've read the Bible many times. I am the way, like I am the light, blah blah blah. I didn't know. It's like he was saying I'm literally the light and like possessing like qualities that are like the characteristics that light would have.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean like Jesus is a photon or something,
right.
But there's kind of some correlations between those ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, anyways, that's what I was referring to in class when I said in quantum mechanics there's a lot of analogies that help explain some of the oddities about God. Another one is this idea of entanglement. And that's the idea where, let's say you have two particles separated by a distance. Mm-hmm. If those particles are entangled, if you switch something about the first one, the second one will know it somehow and switch also.
Oh yeah, I think you talked about this also. How
I said a little bit about it.
They're still connected somehow, like...
They're still connected.
California to New York, but...
Sure. Yeah, and the other particle will know the first one moved, or did something. Okay. And like the science fiction extrapolation would be like teleportation. Okay.
Can you give a specific like real life example of how that would happen? How like one particle would change and then the other one?
Yeah, there's no like practical. It's made its way into the common public. But what happens is like if you have one particle that's spin up. And say another one is spin up and they're entangled, if you switch the spin of the first one, the second one's spin will change also. Mm-hmm. You know how we talked about spin and something else? Yeah, so that's where most of the research has been done.
Okay.
And these two particles being separated by some distance.
So that's been proved before though?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
It's totally been shown before. And what they're trying to do is say, like, oh, what for like practical applications could this have? Could it, like transfer of information? What if you could transfer information over a distance, having no like radio waves or anything like that? Yeah, amazing amount of stuff you could probably think of that could go with that. And so the interesting thing about God is that one way it relate is God is like all-knowing. So he knows what's happening separated by a distance from him. So, he could be in heaven, yet know what's going on in Asia, Africa, California, Texas, etc.
Omnipresent in all those places too.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that idea, that theological idea, which sounds really weird, kind of has an interesting science correlation with entanglement.
So then